Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Thursday night shir. The shir is Le'ili Nishmas Daniela Shena Aleho Hashalom Bas Yeshua Falak Sheyichya. May her neshama have an aliyah. Alle Yidden Ayashia. The Kranke Arafia, the Gezinta Ayashia. Good things for Jews all over the world. We, of course, are in the middle of a series about David HaMelech and his life and his experiences. For references, if you'd like, we are studying Shmuel Aleph, the first book of Shmuel, Perek Chof Aleph, chapter 21. At this stage, David and Yonasan, that is the son of King Shaul, have communicated to each other, with each other. They've come to the conclusion that, in fact, Shaul, the king, wishes to kill David. David realizes once again that his life is in danger. Yonasan, the one that Torah describes as being David HaMelech's closest and sole friend, soul, S-O-U-L, sole friend, also can see clearly that his father Shaul wants to kill David. And David once again flees the palace and the city in an effort to spare and to save and to prolong his life. Now, at this point, the Torah tells one of the more famous stories about David HaMelech. It's famous for being one of the most tragic stories, and I'm sure it's a story you're all at least generally familiar with. I'll go through the story briefly in general because, again, it's very famous, and then there's a couple of parts to it, some medrash, and one piece of Gemara in particular that I want to focus on this evening. So this is known as the story of David and the city of Noiv, which is described by the Torah as a city of Kohanim. So why is Noiv a significant city, and what is going on here? So, okay, until David declared Yerushalayim, until David made Yerushalayim the city in which Hashem's Beis HaMikdash, Hashem's holy home, would stand eternally. Until that point, there was also a Beis HaMikdash, there was also a temple, a sanctuary. It wasn't a permanent sanctuary, but there was a sanctuary among the Jewish people. In fact, the Jewish people had it from the moment they walked into the land of Israel. They had it even before they walked into the land of Israel. They had a Mishkan while they were still in the desert for 40 years. But until it was finally established permanently by David HaMelech in Yerushalayim, the temporary Beis HaMikdash, known actually as the Mishkan, was in different places throughout the land of Eretz Yisrael. It was very famously in a city called Shiloh for a while. It was very famously in a city called Givon for a while. And it was also very famously in a city called Noiv. Noiv, a city in Eretz Yisrael, a city in the land of Israel that housed the home of Hashem before Yerushalayim, was one of the stations where the home of Hashem was located before its final resting place in the city of Yerushalayim. David HaMelech, while he was fleeing his father-in-law and the king of the time, Shaul, arrives, the Torah says, in the city of Noiv. He arrives there alone. The city of Noiv, of course, is inhabited primarily by Kohanim, the ones who do the service, who do the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash at the time. The Kohen Gadol is a man, the Torah says his name was Achimelech. David arrives in Noiv, the city of Kohanim, led by Achimelech the Kohen Gadol, on a Shabbos. But David arrives alone. David arrives defenseless, and David arrives starving to death on Shabbos. He runs to Achimelech. Achimelech, the Kohen Gadol, takes one look at him and immediately recognizes him as the son-in-law of the king and the one who had slain Goliath. And Achimelech says to David, "What are you doing here? Why are you here alone?" And David tells Achimelech, David, the one who is fleeing from Shaul, tells Achimelech the Kohen Gadol that he is here on a secret message of the king. He's here to accomplish a particular mission. The king has sent me, says David, to accomplish something, to take care of something, but the nature of my mission is top secret. I cannot tell you what it is. I can only tell you, says David, that me and my men, the men who were not accompanying David at this stage, David had sent them to a different place. We are starving to death. We're desperate for food, and we have no weapons. We have no weaponry. So if you can give us anything to feed us and to arm us, we would be ever so grateful. Achimelech tells David that he doesn't really have anything for him. He tells him, I don't really have bread for you, and I don't really have weaponry for you. However, Achimelech, the Kohen Gadol, does make two very significant offers to David. He tells him the following. He tells him, look, number one, today is Shabbos. On Shabbos, in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple, they would do an avodah, they would do a service called the Lechem HaPonim. The details of which, again, I don't want to get into right now. But in short, as you all know, there were 12 loaves of what was called Lechem HaPonim, or showbread, that were exchanged every Shabbos in the Beis HaMikdash. A new set of loaves were brought in. The old set of loaves were removed. Miraculously, these breads remained fresh all week. Miraculously, these breads remained warm all week. They weren't actually, by the way, they weren't actually bread. They were actually matzah that sat in the Beis HaMikdash all week long. And Achimelech, the Kohen Gadol, tells David, if you'd like, I can give you chamisha lechem, 5 of the breads from the Lechem HaPonim. They are holy bread. They have to be eaten in a state of purity and sanctity. And under normal circumstances are consumed and eaten only by the Kohanim. But if you, David HaMelech, are here on a secret message of the king, and you and your men need food desperately for fear of starvation, I'm happy to give these breads to you, says Achimelech to David, and he does. Achimelech gives David the breads, and David takes them, consumes some of it, and takes the rest to his people. With regard to the weaponry, with regard to providing David with armor, Achimelech says, we don't have anything. This is a city of Kohanim. This is a Beis HaMikdash. We don't have anything here. The only thing that he did say, Achimelech did say we have, was actually the sword of Goliath. Goliath's sword, the Pelishti, the Philistine that David himself had killed. After David had killed him, Goliath had a mighty sword. The sword had ended up somehow in Noiv, in the Beis HaMikdash. And Achimelech tells David, I will consult with the Urim V'Tumim. I will consult with that secret name of Hashem that was hidden in the garments of the Kohen Gadol. And if Hashem gives me permission, I will give you Goliath's sword, and you may take it. Achimelech consults with Hashem. He gets the green light. David is given the sword of Goliath. He takes the sword and the breads, and he leaves. Now, the story would have ended there if not for the fact that there was another individual who was present in Noiv while this happened and was aware of the entire story. This man's name, says the Torah, is Doeg Hoadoimi. This week, I'm not going to get into the full history of who Doeg was and where he came from and what his agenda was. We'll have a separate shiur with Hashem's help on that. Suffice it to say for today that Doeg Hoadoimi was a great Talmid Chacham and very loyal to Shaul HaMelech. Doeg watches and is aware of the entire encounter. The way David asks the Kohen Gadol for food and for weaponry, and the way the Kohen Gadol gives him the Lechem HaPonim and the sword of Goliath from the Beis HaMikdash. And Doeg finds the opportunity to report the whole story back to King Shaul himself. Doeg tells the king that David, who is at this point the king's official arch enemy, that is, David is the king's official arch enemy. Doeg went to the city of Kohanim. He asked them for bread and for weaponry, and Achimelech the Kohen Gadol facilitated these requests for David and gave him what he asked for. When Shaul hears Doeg repeat the story, Doeg presented the story to Shaul in a way that made it sound like Achimelech the Kohen Gadol and all of the Kohanim who were there present at the time were aware that David was fleeing Shaul. They were aware of the hatred, of the animosity from the king to David, and their facilitating, their helping David was a form of a rebellion against Shaul. So again, when Doeg presents the story to Shaul, he presents it as a giant conspiracy. How all of the Kohanim, led by the Kohen Gadol, are helping David and his men in their rebellion against Shaul HaMelech. When Shaul hears this, Shaul decrees that the entire city of Kohanim must be executed. They must receive capital punishment for rebelling against the king. And Shaul then dispatches Doeg himself to Noiv, the city of Kohanim, to massacre all of the Kohanim. And Doeg, in fact, does exactly as he is instructed. And the entire city of Kohanim, led by Achimelech the Kohen Gadol, are put to death in the hands of Doeg Ha'adomi and the army provided for him by King Shaul. That's how this particular story ends. The Gemara says that as a result of this, Doeg, despite him being a great Talmid Chacham, and at one stage even the head of the Sanhedrin, Doeg Ha'adomi will never merit to receive a share in the world to come. Eilu she'ein lehem chelek lo'olam haba, says the Mishnah in Masechta Sanhedrin, one of the individuals who will never merit to have a portion in the world to come is Doeg Ha'adomi, because of this story, because of the part that he played in the massacre of Noiv, the city of Kohanim. Shaul HaMelech himself and 3 of his sons, including Yonasan and 2 of Yonasan's brothers, 2 other sons of Shaul, are destined to die by the sword in one of the wars against the Plishtim, also as a result of the part that they played in the story of the massacre of Noiv, the city of Kohanim. David HaMelech himself is also punished because of the role that he played in the story of Noiv, the city of Kohanim. Although he himself seemingly doesn't do anything wrong, he's just desperately trying to save himself. But the idea that he had a hand in it, and that apparently he wasn't fully transparent with Achimelech, with the Kohen Gadol and the citizens of Noiv, he didn't tell them that he was running away from Shaul. He didn't tell them that Shaul was trying to kill him. In fact, he made it sound like he was there as an emissary of Shaul. David also faces retribution for the role that he played in this particular story. There's a famous story in the Gemara where the Gemara says Hashem told David, you yourself are also going to have to get kapara, forgiveness, for the part that you played in the story. Okay. This is the story. Literally everybody whose hands are involved in the story, David, Doeg, Shaul, and 3 of his sons, everybody suffers retribution for the story, considered a terrible stain in Jewish history. The massacre of many innocent Kohanim at the hands of Doeg Ha'adomi and his men. All right. There's a very interesting medrash. The medrash is in Chumash Vayikra, in the beginning of Parshas Emor, toward the end of Chumash Vayikra. The Parsha of Emor begins with the words, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Hashem spoke to Moshe and said, Emor el HaKohanim, speak to the Kohanim, which is a strange expression. Usually when Hashem gives Moshe instructions, these instructions are commanded to the Jewish people. You don't find anywhere, I don't believe anywhere else in the Torah this expression, Emor el HaKohanim. So the Medrash explains that there is a background, there's a behind-the-scenes story as to why Hashem chooses to use these words, Emor el HaKohanim. You see, my friends, it turns out, says the Medrash, that Hashem showed Moshe, before Moshe died, all of Jewish history. Everything that would befall the Jews until Tchias HaMesim, until the revival of the dead, was shown to Moshe Rabbeinu by Hashem before he passed. And in the process of Hashem showing Moshe everything that would befall the Jewish people, Moshe saw what happened to Rabbi Akiva. Moshe saw what happened to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Moshe saw what happens to the Tanoim, the Amoraim, the Spanish Inquisition, Rahman al-Islam, the Holocaust. Moshe saw it all. And at one stage, the Medrash says, Hashem shows him Shaul HaMelech and his sons falling on the sword as they waged war against the Plishtim. And Moshe Rabbeinu protests, as he sometimes does. And he says, Rabbeinu Shalom, the master of the world, Melech Rishon Sheyamod al Bonecha, the very first king that will be appointed over the Jewish people, Shaul HaMelech, Yidoker Becherev, should die by being pierced by a sword. Can't we find a more respectful way for this man to meet his maker? Melech Rishon Sheyamod al Bonecha, the first king that will ever rise up over the Jewish people. The first king was Shaul. Why? Why such a horrible, humiliating, and gruesome death? Omar Loya Kodesh Baruch Hu, says the Medrash, Hashem turns to Moshe and says, Liyat Omer, you're trying to convince me? Why are you telling this to me? Emoir el HaKohanim. Go and speak to the Kohanim. Meaning what? Says the Rabbeinu Shalom, you want to give Shaul a respectful death? You want to give Shaul a respectful hour of demise? Hashem says, you got no issues with me. You don't got a community. I'm sold on this. Go talk to the Kohanim. Which Kohanim? Says the Medrash. Hashem says to Moshe, go talk to the Kohanim Shehei Mekatri Gimalov, the Kohanim that were massacred in the city of Noiv, who are standing, all of these Kohanim in heaven, and prosecuting the king, King Shaul, and saying, Rabbeinu Shalom, this king is responsible for our death. Hashem says to Moshe, Emor el HaKohanim. Communicate with the Kohanim. Let me know how well that goes. You try to convince the Kohanim that King Shaul deserves an honorable send-off, Hashem says, and then I'll be happy to let him have a much more peaceful death. That's the reason, says the Medrash, why the Torah uses the expression Emor el HaKohanim. Hashem says to Moshe, if you'd like, please go and talk to them. Apparently, either Moshe didn't try, or if he tried, it didn't work. The sin of these Kohanim being killed was held against Shaul and his three sons, to the point that one of the consequences they faced for this was that they died in the hands of the sword. And then there is a classic passage of Talmud. One of the obsessions of the Talmud in general is to show how seemingly small things can have such titanic and cosmic repercussions. So often the Gemara will point out that what seems like the tiniest gesture or the tiniest moment or the tiniest decision had repercussions that literally changed the course of Jewish history. Says the Gemara, Tractate Sanhedrin, Daf Kuf Dalet, in an unbelievable passage of Talmud. Says the Gemara, 2 loaves of bread determine the future of Jewish history. 2 loaves of bread determine the future of personal history and of human history, one way or the other. Jews have a complicated relationship with food. Says the Gemara, no matter what happens, it always boils down to 2 loaves of bread. And if the 2 loaves of bread are served at the right time, the repercussions will reverberate throughout history. And if the 2 loaves of bread are restrained at the right time or at the wrong time, the repercussions will once again reverberate throughout history. And we find this both in Torah. Says the Gemara, I'll show you an example where 2 loaves of bread were served by the right man at the right time in the right place, and they reaped the benefits for centuries. And I'll show you an example where 2 loaves of bread were withheld, and the results were catastrophic. First, let's start with the positive. Says the Gemara, Omar Rabbi Yochanan taught, quote, Bischar, in the reward for Kir en loy v'yoicha lochem, call him and he shall eat bread. Zochu bnei bona v'yoshvu b'lishkas hagozis. His descendants were members of the Sanhedrin. What does that mean? Well, of course, you all remember the famous story where Moshe has to flee. Moshe Rabbeinu has to flee the king of Egypt who wants to kill him. Yes? And he ends up in the land of Midian, approximately 60 years later. Vayeshev ala be'er, the Torah says, and he ends up at the well. Ulakoyin Midian sheva bonais, and the priest of Midian has 7 daughters, and they come to the well, and they're harassed by the local shepherds. And Moshe helps these women, the daughters of the priest of Midian, provide water for their flock. And they come home. And their father, whose name was Yisro, sees his daughters come home and he says, how'd you get home so quickly? And they tell him that an Egyptian man had helped them by the well, had saved them from the harassment of the other shepherds. And that's how they were able to provide water for their flock and make it home so quickly. And Yisro says, why did you abandon this man at the well? Quote, Kir en loy, summons him. Ve'yoicha lochem, let him eat bread. Summons this man. Let's serve him dinner. 2 loaves of bread. They go back to the well. They find Moshe Rabbeinu. They tell him, our father has invited you to eat bread. And Moshe comes to their home and they break bread. And he ends up marrying Yisro's oldest daughter, Tzipporah, becoming Moshe Rabbeinu. And his descendants, says the Gemara, the descendants of Moshe and his father-in-law and his wife Tzipporah and his father-in-law Yisro in the end were members of the highest Bezdin of the land, Zochu v'yoshvu bonov b'lishkas hagozis, in the chamber of the temple where the Supreme Court sat. Imagine, says the Gemara, if Yisro had heard the story from his daughters and said, oh, very nice. An Egyptian man helped you at the well. So nice of him. That's wonderful. I wish there were more people like him in this world. Please, the next time you see him, send him my regards. Tell him that Yisro says, thank you very much. You helped my daughters and you restored the dignity of my family. But imagine if he had not invited him that night to dinner. Imagine if he hadn't said those words, Kir en loy v'yoicha lochem, call him and let him eat bread. The shidduch would have never been made. Moshe would never have married Tzipporah. Tzipporah would have married somebody else. Moshe would have married somebody else. And Yisro would never have merited to have descendants who sat in the highest court of the land and taught Torah to the Jews that would be treasured for all eternity. 2 loaves of bread changed the course of the life of a man and his family and his descendants for all times. Because he served him dinner on the right time, on the right particular evening. On the other hand, says the Gemara, sometimes the absence of 2 loaves of bread can have catastrophic results. In this case, the Gemara faults Yonasan. Amazing. Yonasan, Jonathan, David HaMelech's best friend. They swore their eternal love and commitment to each other. Says the Gemara, could you imagine if before Yonasan and David took leave of each other, after Yonasan had communicated to David that his father Shaul wants to kill him, after he told him to run for his life, after Yonasan told David that all of his begging and pleading and desperately trying to talk sense into Shaul's head had failed, and Shaul was beyond repair, he was beyond reasoning. He was determined to kill David, and Yonasan made it clear to David that he was on David's side, not his father Shaul's side. And he told David to flee. Says the Gemara, Il mole hilvohu li Yonasan le David, shtei kikares lechem. If at that moment Yonasan had only given David, had only escorted him, had only sent him on his way with 2 loaves of bread, David would not have descended to that level of life endangering starvation. He wouldn't have ended up in the city of Noiv Koyanim and spun his seemingly disingenuous tale. Says the Gemara, the Koyanim would have been spared, the Koyanim would have lived. Loinergo Noiv Ira Koyanim, the whole city would not have been killed. Doeg Hoadoimi would have merited a share in the world to come. And Shaul and his 3 sons would not have been killed, or at least not like that. Of course, Yonasan didn't do it intentionally. But the right thing for him to have done at that point would have been to give David food before he sent him off on such a treacherous journey. The Gemara faults Yonasan for this. How do you allow a best friend of yours to leave your house without food, without a tuna sandwich, Ribono Shel Olam? If you would have had food, the course of history would have continued in a completely different direction. Yisro understood this. He offered Moshe the bread. He had his daughters go and find, before he knew who it was, he had his daughters go and find him and bring him home and feed him. As a result, his descendants were part of the Great Sanhedrin. Yonasan apparently missed this memo. He sent David off on the road without food. Because of that, the city of Kohanim was wiped out. Doeg loses his share in the world to come. And Shaul and 3 of his sons are massacred by the Plishtim. All as repercussions for what happened with the story of Noiv and its Kohanim inhabitants. What's the Gemara really trying to say? Of course, the Gemara is telling us the importance of sometimes seemingly insignificant acts. Of course, the Gemara is telling us the importance of the mitzvah of achnosas orchim, of providing for guests. Of course. Of course, the Gemara is teaching us the importance of never letting guests leave your home without providing them with some provisions. A halacha, by the way. One should never allow guests to leave one's home if they're headed on a journey without making sure that they have some element of provision, something to eat. Rahman al-Islam, a person gets stuck, their flight gets delayed, God knows what. You have to make sure people have provisions. Of course, the Gemara is trying to tell us all of that. But there's a much greater and a much greater, more important, and much deeper lesson that the Gemara is communicating here. The Gemara is telling us that the Torah is replete with huge stories, big stories, leaders, kings, cities, Kohanim Gedolim, tragic stories of cities of Kohanim being wiped out, stories about Moshe Rabbeinu and his wife, the one who saved the Jews, and his descendants sat in the highest court of the Jewish people in the Beis Hamikdash, Lishkas HaKodesh. The Torah is replete with these stories that are so titanically big, about big people who occupy so much room, so much airspace in the Torah. And the Gemara is saying behind every big story, there's a little story that triggers the big story. Behind every great man who rises to power, there is a moment in which his future and his destiny is sealed. And it's usually a quiet moment, which could go unnoticed. Behind every story of death and destruction and the collapse of sometimes our great leaders and kings, behind these big stories, there's a moment of decision of small failures where somebody made a bad decision. And these decisions get catapulted and get avalanched and grow and become the stories that define our lives and our people's history. Sometimes these small stories have more of an impact. What we perceive, as small stories and small gestures have more of an impact than what we perceive to be as the big stories and the big impact. You know, the Talmud says very famously that there's a difference between the first luchas, the first tablets that Hashem gave Moshe Rabbeinu, and the second. The Gemara says the first set of luchas were given b'koilus abrokim, with thunder and lightning. There was so much commotion. When God gave the Torah, the whole world stood still. Everybody was in a state of shock. It was a huge story. And they did not last. They were broken into pieces. Shivrei luchas, broken pieces of luchas is all that remained from them. The second set of luchas were given without fanfare and without excitement, without lightning and without miracles. Moshe carried them down from the mountain on one quiet day. They were seen as a replacement for the first set of luchas. And specifically because there was no fanfare, they were given betzina quietly. They remained. They lasted. And because of them, the Jewish people were able to preserve the Torah among their people. A decision about 2 loaves of bread will determine the course of Jewish history, one way or the other. You see, most of us will not make the kinds of decisions in our lifetime, like David HaMelech and Shaul HaMelech, or even Doeg HaAdoim. Most of us will not make decisions that will at least on the surface carry the type of repercussions of whether cities should be wiped out or spared, of who will sit in the Lishkas HaGozis in the Beis HaMikdash and who won't. Most of us don't operate on that level. But you know what we do to control and determine? You know what kinds of decisions we make every single day? Decisions about 2 loaves of bread. If we'll be kind to guests and travelers, if we'll be kind to strangers, if we'll give tzedakah in our own humble way, according to our own abilities, that's what we get to decide. And those decisions really sit behind every one of these great stories that we read about in the Torah. What's the Torah trying to tell us? The city of Kohanim was destroyed. David HaMelech, Doeg HaAdoim, giants of men. Says the Gemara, you know what the Torah wants to tell you and I? Next time you have a guest and you see him off, make sure he has what to eat for breakfast. Make sure he has a loaf of bread to eat for dinner. Make sure he doesn't go hungry. That's the story. That's the future of the Jewish people. And that's what will determine one way or the other, which direction, which way things go. We feel like we can't control the big stuff. We feel like we can only control the small stuff. But in the end, the Gemara says the big stuff is really just an expression of the small stuff. And the decisions we make about how we treat people in the privacy and the quietness and the stillness of our own homes, where we think no one's watching and where we think no one cares and where we think it's not significant. But dafka there, that is what changes the course of history. one way or the other, for the positive or, God forbid, for the negative. I heard a fantastic story. The Lubavitcher Rebbe had a cardiologist whose name was Dr. Weiss. Dr. Weiss lived in Chicago and sent his children, of course, to a Jewish school. And in the Jewish school, the children had a Hebrew teacher. And the Hebrew teacher developed a relationship with Dr. Weiss, with the Rebbe's cardiologist. And they got to talking, and Dr. Weiss was telling him, I have this relationship with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He's an amazing Rebbe. You should come and see him, like a good chassid. You should come and see him one day. And the Hebrew teacher says, look, I'm not a chassid. I'm not particularly his follower. I'm a Hebrew teacher. What do you want from me? And the Rebbe's cardiologist says, no, you got to come and you got to meet this guy. And I have protectia. I have connections, The Lubavitcher Rebbe had a heart attack on the night of Shmini Atzeres in 1977. Dr. Weiss was instrumental in bringing him back to health. He said, I have connections with this Rebbe. I can get you in to see him. Next time I go to Crown Heights, Dr. Weiss tells his children's Hebrew teacher, I'm going to take you with me. All right. It's not a good idea to argue with a cardiologist. At some point, the Hebrew teacher says, okay, I'll go. And so this Hebrew teacher finds himself in the room of the Rebbe. 770 Eastern Parkway, Brooklyn, New York. And the Rebbe says, Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom, who are you? Where are you from? Etc., etc. And the Rebbe asks him, tell me, what do you do? He says, I'm a Hebrew teacher. I teach children. I'm an educator. I teach them the Hebrew language in school. Says the Rebbe. A teacher. A teacher of young children. The Rebbe said, teachers can have a tremendously powerful impact on their students. Children's minds are so alert and so open. They're so ready to hear and learn. The ideas, the skills, the impact that you have upon your students can last them an entire life. Think about it, says the Rebbe. Perhaps one day some of your students will themselves become teachers and they will have an ability to impact other students. The ideas, the lessons, the example that you lead can change the lives of your students, who can change the lives of their families and their students, who can change the lives of their friends and their acquaintances. Everything has ripple effect. Think about it, says the Rebbe. As a teacher with such vulnerable yet powerful Jewish minds in your classroom, you can change the whole world. Which, of course, is classic thinking, classic approach of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But the Hebrew teacher was, I don't know if he was not impressed, or if he was not excited, or if he was not interested, or if he was unaware. He didn't turn him on, this idea that he can change the whole world. He wasn't looking to change the whole world. He wasn't trying to change anybody, for that matter. He was just trying to do his job. So he tells the Rebbe, in Hebrew, of course, because they talked in Hebrew. He tells the Rebbe, you're telling me I can change the whole world? I'm not interested. Ani rak Yehudi pashut. I'm just a simple Jew. Just let me do my job. Just let me do my job. Let me collect my paycheck. Let me go home, take care of my family. Ani rak Yehudi pashut. I'm just a simple Jew. And the Rebbe looked at him and said, yes. Ani gamken rak Yehudi pashut, said the Rebbe. I'm also just a simple Jew. Just the same as you. Who do you think is going to change the world? Who do you think is going to make the world a better place? Who do you think is going to have an impact and change and accomplish tremendous things? Who do you think is going to set the course of history on its proper track? Yehudi Pashut, a simple Jew. And how is he or she going to do that? Through the tiniest and most simple and most seemingly mundane gestures. Be a mensch. Say good morning. Be kind. Say good Shabbos to people in the street. Look them in the face. Say, how are you? Mean what you say. Say what you mean. Be kind to your guests, and you'll set the world on a straight course. Don't tell me, said the Rebbe, that you're, quote, just a simple Jew. No Jew is just a simple Jew. Every Jew has the power to have an unbelievable impact, an impact that will reverberate throughout history. Yes, some of us lead very seemingly humble and private lives, but the decisions we make reverberate throughout history. This particular story, the story of Noiv Ir HaKohanim, is known as a very sad chapter in the story of everybody's life. David, Doeg, the Kohanim, Shaul HaMelech and his son and his family, definitely. It's known as a very sad chapter in his life. And the Gemara has the gall. The Gemara has the gall to say that the whole thing could have been avoided. What's the Gemara trying to say? It wasn't the will of God. Let God run the world the way God knows how. But the Gemara says, on a human level, from your perspective, the whole thing could have been all the bloodshed and the disaster and the animosity that came from it, that reverberated for centuries. The whole thing could have been avoided if one man would have given his friend, his best friend, food for the journey. If he wouldn't have let him leave his home empty-handed. Shtei kikrais lechem, 2 loaves of bread. The whole thing could have been avoided. Think about that next time. You give make some small gesture to some Jew who maybe you need. Think about that next time you ask yourself, of what consequence, what impact am I having in this world? Think about that next time we read a story in Torah about the greatest of the great, about the David HaMelechs and the Shaul HaMelechs. Their lives, their experiences would have taken a different course through the simplest and seemingly even smallest of decisions. May Hashem help us that as we learn these lessons, we take them to heart and never, ever, not for a moment, underestimate the importance of what we sometimes perceive as the smallest of gestures in our day-to-day life. Have a wonderful week and a wonderful Shabbos.